In order for the world to close gender gaps, it's very important that we track them and measure them over time. This report tries to do exactly that. We try to understand the gaps between women and men on health, education, economic participation, and political empowerment. We're trying to understand whether women have the same rights and opportunities as men, regardless of whether they're in rich countries or poor countries. In 2014, we cover 142 economies. While no country in the world has fully closed the gender gap, the Nordic countries have closed over 80% of it. Iceland, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark occupy the top 5 spots in the rankings. Rwanda enters the rankings for the first time this year. The Philippines, at number 9, is the highest ranking Asian country. The US comes back into the top 20, while the UK slips down to 26. Out of the BRICS countries, South Africa is the highest ranking country at number 18, followed by Brazil at 71, Russia at 75, China at 87, and India at 114. Out of the Arab countries, Kuwait is the highest ranking at 113, followed by the UAE at 115. The bottom 3 countries remain Chad, Pakistan, and Yemen. We now have 9 years of data, almost a decade worth of information. Out of the 111 countries that have been covered since 2006, 105 have been making progress. What's also positive is where the change is coming from. Saudi Arabia, relative to itself, is the country that has made the most progress on economic participation. In the case of education, it's Burkina Faso. But there are countries that are falling backwards. 30% of countries are losing the gains they've made on education, and nearly 40% are moving backwards on health. People and their talents are the key resource that drives most economies. But the benefits of gender equality go beyond the economic case. Women are 1/2 of the world's population. They deserve equal access to health, education, earning potential, and political empowerment. Because ultimately, gender equality is a vital part of humanity's progress.
For the past decade, the majority of graduates from relevant studies have been women. Women now make up 60% of those graduating from economics, law, and business courses. But in spite of years of rhetoric on workplace equality and equality in management, the share of women in the highest decision-making bodies of larger publicly listed companies in Europe is only 14%. While the situation differs from one EU country to another, we need to ensure equal representation of women, particularly in top decision-making positions. Leaving it up to companies themselves has not worked. But binding targets for women on boards have proven to be successful. Countries like Norway and Finland already have 40% of women on boards, for example. It is a myth that current recruitment policies are based on quality alone, and that binding quotas would undermine this. Binding targets will stimulate companies to seek talent in new ways and have more quality-based recruitment. It also makes good business sense to have companies with more diverse boards. Research has shown that companies with above-average numbers of female directors perform better overall. Equality between men and women is a fundamental right and a core commitment of the EU. The Greens believe there should be equality at all levels. We want a 50-50 representation of men and women in senior management. Binding targets can help give the first push. The European Union needs legislation to ensure a minimum female representation on the boards of larger companies. Proposals to introduce a binding 40% boardroom quota would be a step in the right direction. Support us and help us to get women on boards. www.get-women-on-board.eu.
Well, I was initially extremely disconcerted when Andrew told me what the theme of this conference would be, because it made me feel as though if we were talking about rebalancing, we'd be talking about a world that had somehow once been in balance and then gone out of balance, and we were going to reset the balance and walk away. You know, and one of my passions as a historian, and especially as someone who studies family relationships and personal life, is that there's no such thing as equilibrium. You know, you do not every time you solve one old imbalance or one improbable, one old problem, you set new ones into motion. And so that there's really, you can't set it like a clock and walk away. So that the goal of us as researchers, as a society, as family members, as people in a marriage, is not to hope that you're ever going to reach equilibrium, but to find better ways of continually monitoring the changes that we set in motion when we make any new change or action, and adjusting our behaviors and our goals even in ways that allow us to move on. Rebalancing, in other words, is not something you do once. It's a way of life for societies, for researchers, for families, and for individuals. And I think rebalancing, of course, needs reframing, which is one of the good things about why this session was titled that. And Robert and Niels today are going to be talking about how to reframe our definitions of wealth, development, and power to account for informal, whether licit or illicit, sectors of the economy that are not generally included in national and international definitions of wealth and power. We're going to have people here to talk about how we have to reframe our notion of what a security threat is. I'm looking forward to that very much. The environmental issues that we're going to be discussing over the next 3 days require us to reframe traditional definitions of gross domestic product to take account of things that scientists, for example, call externalities. The activities that may in fact generate, the activities between private individuals that may in fact generate private wealth that then gets counted in our gross domestic product, even though it may in fact reduce public wealth and deplete natural resources. And I, as someone who studies family relationships, am concerned about the imbalance between our measures of gross domestic product, I almost said progress there, which would contradict the point I was trying to make, and what you might call internalities. The same things that even though they may not be done for pay, they may not contribute to the national profits, are what make our lives better as individuals and improve our relationships with family, with community, and others. So today I want to talk about, actually, before I talk about the new imbalances that we've created with men and women and work and family, I want to spend some time reviewing one of the great victories of globalization, the gender rebalancing that's been going on, which is a huge success story. Now, a lot of people misunderstand what that imbalance was. You know, they think about a time when women weren't in the workforce and now women have joined the workforce. That's actually nonsense. The male breadwinner family of Ozzie and Harriet fame was a short-lived historical aberration of the mid-20th century that never existed before and will never exist again. For thousands of years, men were not the breadwinners who brought home the bacon. Women were the people who made the bread, raised the pig, cured the bacon, and usually took it to market. But their productive roles did not give them any ownership over the resources that they produced or any say in the household or society as a whole. So the balance then was sort of like somebody putting a foot on the seesaw and holding someone down. And the rebalancing has been so important, and it has been because women have entered the paid labor force. And this is the first part of it, the first beginnings of women's rights occurred when young single women were pulled into the low-wage manufacturing jobs associated with the early expansion of the global market economy. It's like textile. Over the last 80 to 100 years, married women as well have been pulled into the expansion of the industrial economy, the global consumer economy, as lifelong paid workers. And that's when you really got the takeoff in women's rights. And everywhere it's been the same. The mix of, I don't want to glorify it, the mix of empowerment along with exploitation that pulling of women into the workforce created is what has created the worldwide movement for women's rights. And it's been very impressive, and it's always gone along the same lines. Women begin to enter the labor force, their literacy rates rise, they begin to agitate for more public rights, they begin to be able to control their their reproductive rights, they get some choice over who they marry or whether or not to marry. And what we see internationally, for example, the birth rate since just 1970, and I'm going to argue even nationally, just since 1970 is when this revolution really got kicked in, and that was when women were pulled into the workforce. For example, the birth rates of women in the developing world have been halved since 1970. In 2009, the World Economic Forum did a study of 134 countries and found that they had, in the last 40 years, closed the gender gap in health outcomes by 96% and the gender gap in educational attainment by 93%. And one of the really interesting things is that the countries that are most resistant to women's rights are the ones where women have the least access to the labor force. In fact, there's just fascinating research about some of the inequities in places like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And the suggestion is that it's not so much the intractability of Islamic tradition that accounts for this, but the oil wealth of these societies that diverted the economy from traditional manufacturing and export growth, such as textiles, that pulled women into the labor market. One researcher has found that for every $1,200 increase in per capita oil profits in a country, there's a 2% decline in the number of women officials. And it's a cumulative decline, so it really mounts up for a while. And of course, as women do not have the right to earn their own livings and to legislate their own fate, they are much more likely to support fundamentalist movements that tell them, since you can't support yourself, since you can't take care of yourself, brothers, husbands, and fathers will take care of it for you. It's even true that in the United States, that despite a long history of agitation for women's rights, it really was not until the influx of women into the labor force as permanent employees in the 1970s that you began to see changes. You know, a lot of people really don't realize what it was like in the mid-60s in America, where we still, there were help-wanted female ads and help-wanted male ads. The help-wanted female ads were often for perky college grads with good typing skills. Sometimes they said things that was perfectly legal to say things, as one New York Times ad that ran over and over again. The guy must have been a little picky. You must be really beautiful. Women were legally paid lower wages for the jobs that they took. They didn't have access to the high-wage jobs available to men. There was no such, there was no law against sexual harassment. Sexual harassment didn't become illegal in the United States until 1993. For women who weren't pulled into the labor force or who were married. There was no such thing as marital rape. The laws considered that a laughable contradiction in terms because when a woman said, "I do," she was presupposed to say, "I have said I will" for the rest of her life. Most states and most countries in Western Europe had head and master laws right up until the 1970s that gave the man the final say over how the income was used, if his wife could take a job or even a credit card, if she could sign a lease. There was a case in 1972 in New York where a woman whose husband was in an insane asylum couldn't rent an apartment to be near him unless he signed the lease. There were also the fact that the husband decided where you lived meant that if a man moved away, and you, as his wife, didn't follow him, maybe you were taking care of your elder parents, he could charge you with desertion and win a fault-based divorce. And I don't even have time to get into the horrifying attitudes and legal definitions of child sexual abuse and wife beating. But if you want a story that will curl your hair, grab me at one of the breaks and I'll tell you about that. So, of course, there have been trade-offs in the changes of women's rights. There's been a destabilization of traditional families. When you read about traditional families, that's not all bad. But it's been for worse as well as for better. We've seen a huge surge in divorce and unwed births as women entered the workforce in the 70s and 80s. 2/3 of all divorces were and are initiated by women. So the social conservatives who think maybe we should take their jobs away might not be mistaken in that. If we look around the world, you see that countries like China have had like an 800% increase in divorce over the past 25 years. And countries that haven't had such an increase, like Singapore, Italy, Spain, countries that are more socially conservative, those countries where women have tasted the independence of a job, but not where there has not been a change in the laws and the gender inequalities, seem to have gone on strike against marriage and motherhood, with population results that we're all thinking about today. On the other hand, sometimes the empowerment of women has been so great that it actually counteracts the increase in female-headed families. In many parts of Africa, preschool children in female-headed households in Kenya and several other African studies I've looked at, they are allocated such a much higher share of household calories that they actually have better nutritional standards than kids being raised in two-parent male-headed households. In Jamaica, the educational and health outcomes of kids raised in single-parent families are better than those raised in two-parent male households where the women don't have income, despite the fact that they have lower per capita income. And in Guatemala, yes, of course, women still remain shamefully exploited and underpaid in the international labor force, and yet $12 extra in the hands of a Guatemalan mother produces the same weight gain in a child as $166 extra in the hands of a Guatemalan father. So, furthermore, the problems with instability that you often see with the empowerment of women are not so much because of the empowerment of women, but because the empowerment has not gone far enough. There's fascinating cross-cultural research that shows that increases in women's education and earnings only really destabilize relationships in societies and sectors of society where legal and social inequality continues. The longer that women with entrenched traditions of male dominance, the longer that men and women share productive and reproductive labor, and especially the more involved men are in infant care and other forms of child care, the less destabilizing elements go on when women empower themselves. Take something that is always in the newspapers now. Are women pricing themselves out of the labor market? 23% of American wives earn more than their men, than their husbands do. Women's increased education has always been called, Gary Becker called it the independence effect, that's going to destroy marriage, increase divorce. And it's true. You look at countries like Italy or many other countries where women do not have many rights. A woman who gets a little extra earnings or education is less likely to marry. If she does marry, she's 4 to 5 times more likely to divorce. If you look in Sweden, there's no such association. And if you look in America, you actually see the association beginning to reverse. For women born before 1960, such as myself, and so I guess I should consider myself lucky to be married and not divorced, a woman who got higher education or had higher earnings had much less chance of marrying, and if she did marry, especially with the higher earnings, she had a higher chance of divorce. Today, high-earning and high-educated women are much more likely to get married than low-earning and low-earning education women. They're not quite as likely, but almost as likely to marry as women with moderate education and earnings. But they're so much less likely to divorce and even though they marry later, that combines with the lowered likelihood of divorce, so that by age 40, it's the highest earning and highest educated women that are the most likely to be married in the United States. And by the way, if you're one of the many women I meet who is a highly educated woman and a high-earning woman who has reached age 40 without being married and still wants to be married, which is not always the case, you have double the chance of marrying as someone with lower education and earnings. There's been this tremendous reversal. In today's, for example, the divorce rates that soared when women first entered the workplace have been falling steadily. And in fact, it's the states with the most working wives that have the lowest divorce rates of all. Contrary to anti-feminism, women's empowerment has also been good for children. In the developing world, women's education and earnings are associated with very significant declines in child mortality, even here in the United States. Domestic violence has fallen by 30% since 1980. There's been an even sharper decrease in child abuse rates. Women who work outside the home, the men do better child care. They have higher parental knowledge of their children's friends and needs than men whose wives do not work outside the home, and and that pays off in better educational outcomes and social skills for their kids. Now, okay, so I've been talking about the good news, and I have only about 3 minutes to talk about the bad news. There is a new imbalance, of course. When society pulls women into the workforce without changing the work rules and the social policies that were constructed when women were required to take care of everything else in life, you do have a problem. There are now 350 million children in the world under 6 who live in households where every adult in that household works outside the home, and sometimes outside the country. And yet the companies that employ them, the countries that profit from their productivity, do not invest in parental leave, child care, even breastfeeding breaks. Although I have to say 146 countries, not the United States, do say that workers should have the right to breastfeed, which leads me to a point that I think we don't have time to go into at length. I used to say the U.S., had a Neanderthal in terms of its family policies, but I've recently studied the Neanderthals and learned that they took much greater care of their dependents than we do. But the U.S. is dead last among all rich countries in its family work policies. We're the only one that doesn't offer subsidized parental leaves, so that it's not a class privilege to stay home with your kids. The only one that doesn't have work-family policies. We don't have child care. We don't have a national child care system. We don't even have national child care standards for it. And even the Family and Medical Leave Act is the shortest unpaid parental leave provided, and less than half of American workers are eligible for it. So I have to say, despite my enthusiasm about women's empowerment, I get nervous when the World Bank tells us that we could increase US GDP by another 10% if we would completely close the work gap between men and women. But this is a country where 70% of kids under 15, every adult in the household works out. Whereas there's the highest work-family stress for mothers and fathers. And by the way, fathers now report higher work-family stress than mothers do in the US world. And again, and professionals in particular, now work the longest work hours in the world, including Japan. So what do we do about it? I'm certainly not advocating a return to the male breadwinner family. I don't think that I understand why people use the opt-out of having a woman take a few years off, but I think that has some very bad trade-offs involved too, because it perpetuates women's second-class status in the workforce, and it also perpetuates men's second-class status in the family. So I think that we want to continue the movement to pull women into the workforce, But we have to redefine, if we're going to redefine gender to include women's right to paid work, we have to redefine work to include workers' rights to a family life. So the giving women access to careers, okay, I'm running out of time. I think I can finish this in a minute. Women's access to careers has been the great achievements of globalization, not just to jobs, but access to careers for some of us. It's been a huge achievement. But we can no longer sustain a work regime where the only person who can hold down a career is a person who can make himself or occasionally herself completely available full-time to the employer because there is a woman at home, and I guarantee you it's a woman, 9 times out of 10, wife, mother, nanny, or housekeeper who will take care of every other human obligation. So we've had a lot of rewords in this reimagine, redraw, revolution. My favorite is reimagine. Because we can't find a new balance between work and family, between men and women, between production and reproduction until we reimagine the relationships between those things and recalculate their worth, their contribution to national and international development. We have got to get a better balance. One of the things I am so excited about having been brought back to PopTech is that this room, not only the speakers but the audience, includes some of the best cartographers in the country in terms of redrawing maps. Oscar Wilde once said it's a sorry map of the world that contains no island of utopia. It's a sorry map of the world and a sorry set of map makers that can't redraw the boundaries of our interpersonal lives with the same creativity as we are redrawing here the boundaries of our technological and social lives. So map makers, bring it on. Thanks very much.